My name is Father Gregory Pine, and I'm a Dominican friar of the province of St. Joseph, assigned at present at the University of Freiburg, where I am working on my doctorate. But you have probably at this point come to become accustomed to these off-campus conversations, so bi-weekly installments, where we're following up with a particular professor who's given a lecture for the Thomistic Institute, so that way we can kind of suss out some of the insights. So follow up on the principles, maybe work through some of the arguments, and then see what's entailed by what it is that they proposed. So we found that it's a good way to kind of go deeper from the ordinary setting of Thomistic Institute lectures, so that you, the listener, might profit all the more from the wisdom of those who will speak here, there, and everywhere. So today we're joined by Professor Paul Gondreau, coming to us from Providence College in Rhode Island. So thanks so much for joining, Professor Gondreau.
Great to be with you, Father Gregory.
Hey, cheers. So many of our listeners will have listened to your lecture, which will have aired. I'm using a lot of the future perfect tense, which I didn't know existed in English until I studied other languages. But that's what happens when you time travel with, like podcast recordings. So alas, many of our listeners will have listened to your lecture from yesterday. But for those of them who have not, would you just say a word about yourself and then, like who you are, where you're coming from, the type of things that you're working on?
Sure thing. My name is Paul Gondreau, Professor of Theology at Providence College. I've been teaching here in Rhode Island for 25 years now. Since graduate school, which is the same graduate program where you are currently, Father Gregory, I got my doctorate at University of Freiburg. Incidentally, I never understood the subjunctive tense in English until I had to learn in French. I understand how that goes, but I did my doctorate under the great Thomist scholar, Father Jean-Pierre Terrell. While there, I did it on Christology, on Aquinas' theology of the humanity of Christ, more specifically on Christ's human passions. And since then, I have been continuing that work. I have broadened it along more general anthropological lines. So I've published quite a number of essays touching on the moral meaning and purpose of human sexuality, moral life in general, how that bears on Christ and his humanity, on Christ the man, the male Christ. That's what I'm currently, projects I'm working on currently. So, and I've been involved with the Thomistic Institute for a few years now and have very much enjoyed it. I really very much value the kind of students who show up for these lectures. They're just eager to learn. I do teach an introduction to Aquinas course here at Providence College, and I always like to tell them, that I encounter these students at these secular schools that would die, for the opportunity they have, which is that they get to study Thomas Aquinas a couple days a week for a whole semester. Are you kidding me? I'm just saying that there are a lot of people out there who would love to trade places with you.
Hey, well, that warms the cockles of my heart. Because sometimes I'm not entirely sure what's going on. I'm just reading St. Thomas Aquinas. I'm wholly convinced, but I don't know if it corresponds to the deepest desires of other people's hearts. And then I say something and people are like, holy smokes, that's awesome. And I'm like, cool, so I'm not crazy. So I'm glad to have this evidence corroborated yet further. All right, so in your lecture, you talked about specifically the topic of truth, and the way that you ran the argument was a kind of apologetic for the divine institution and like the divine efficacy of the church. So you ran it through Christ, the church, the sacraments, and then the way in which we receive that in the here and now. So maybe one of the things that was fascinating to me was that you kind of just started into the argument. And why is this fascinating to me? Because I think a lot of people clear their throats, which sometimes there's need for throat clearing, but sometimes throat clearing becomes its own science. This is not to make light of epistemology or criteriology as a discipline, but a lot of people want to start first with like, well, if we're going to make claims about knowing, we have to show first that we can know, or that we can know that we can know. But I was struck by the fact that you didn't start with a lot of that. So maybe from whence comes your confidence that we can know the truth? Or maybe what are some ways in which you might argue dialectically that we have this capacity or that we're made for it?
Well, I'm convinced that God has wired us for this, that we're endowed with a rational soul, with a mind that is ordered ultimately to truth, and we hunger for that. We yearn for that. As Aristotle says, that the nature of the mind is to know. We have this deep yearning to know. And and what's the object of knowledge but truth? And so deep down, we live in a world that that wants to poo-poo truth, if not outright deny its knowability or its existence at all. So that nonetheless, despite that, I think it's what people want. It's what people are yearning for. And you dance around, you kind of pussyfoot, or if you make too many overtures. Now I believe firmly in engaging with the culture and dialoguing with the culture. I mean, you got to meet people where they're at. At the same time, the more one nods to that and pays deference to it, you risk doing a disservice to the truth, I think, and to what people really are yearning for. And I mean, heck, I got a limited amount of time the way it is, so let's just get right to it. Let's just dive right in. But I mean, that's how God is with us. He doesn't pull a fast one over us. He doesn't try to club us over the head. And I think his preeminent spokesman theologically, St. Thomas Aquinas, does exactly the same thing. And, but lays it out there, lets his reader decide. I mean, this is pretty evident when you read like Thomas Aquinas. And actually, a little story to tell in this regard. I do teach an introduction to Aquinas theology course at the undergraduate level here at Providence College. And by the end of the semester, I just kind of ask the students, I will ask them, how many of you as a person does St. Thomas just strike you as someone you like? And nearly all of them raise their hand. I ask them to be honest. Then I'll say, how many of you really like Aquinas? Maybe one or two hands at most. Then I'll ask, how many of you don't like Aquinas? No hands, 1, 2 hands at most. And I'll say, I'll wager that a good reason for that is that what you've witnessed in Aquinas is someone who respects you, who respects your mind. He's making rational arguments. He's making moral arguments. He's appealing to your mind and to your heart. He's not trying to pull a fast one over you. And he respects you. He lets you make up your own mind. He makes it clear what he thinks the truth of the matter is, while at the same time giving adequate voice to the opposite side. Aquinas, of course, is famous for giving the best voice to the opposing side. So, that's how I like to approach these matters as well. That where God offers us Himself, and He is truth, and so in terms of intellectual inquiry and study, He offers us the truth. It's up to us to respond, and we're wired for it. We yearn for it. We want it. Of course, we can reject it. Some do reject it, but more often than not, people will, if they don't respond at the outset, at least, there's something I think deep inside that is turned on, and you kind of attitudes start to change, perhaps, if they haven't already come with a desire to know. I mean, these Thomistic Institute lectures, usually you do have an eager audience for them. So they're well disposed. They're receptive. They're openly receptive to what you have to present to them. That does make a difference as well. Not always the case with my undergraduate students, for instance. But it's again, you're always you're structuring lectures and talks in view of your audience, and you want to always keep that in mind and speak to them. So,
I am reminded of a line. I'm going to butcher it, but that's never stopped me before. But it's from G.K. Chesterton's The Dumb Ox, where he acknowledges this kind of like epistemological or criteriological gap. And he says of St. Thomas, in his work of Sacra Doctrina, that St. Thomas acknowledged the gap, built a bridge over it, and then began promptly exploring what lay on the other side, because it was infinitely more real. She's just like, wow, savage. Look at this guy go. But I can understand what you mean in the sense that, we often find ourselves in settings or contexts where it's like the conversation has to be subtle and nuanced in order to get off the ground, or we're constantly being contradicted or called into question. It's like, dude, sometimes I just want to have a conversation where we can just deliver the goods, you know?
Yeah.
And I think there's something refreshing to that, albeit, you know, maybe with some rough edges, but that's okay insofar as we don't let the fear of saying something slightly wrong keep us from saying something very much true. So St. Thomas he just happens, I could say many things there, but I won't, because I'm going to ask you a further question. So you made mention of the fact in the lecture and then just in this last response, how folks in the 21st century sometimes prove themselves allergic to truth claims. I'm not sure if this is worse than before or better than before, or if it differs than other ages of humanity. I have a friend who often quotes Michel Foucault in this regard. He says, there are no good times or bad times. There are just perilous times. So it being the case that this time is a perilous time, do you think there are particular reasons for which the 21st century, or those who live in the 21st century, show themselves or prove themselves allergic to truth claims? Are there ways that we can make sense of this which will help us better to address it?
Yeah, well, it's a good question, and the answer, of course, is a complicated one, because so much of current culture it draws from the well of modern philosophy, and modern philosophy, I think, has played a large role in this general skeptical attitude that a lot of people have towards the search for truth, or even the knowability of truth. But it's the postmodern world in which we live is especially akin to that. I mentioned in the lecture, for instance, when it comes to religion, we're all familiar with these coexist bumper stickers. And while that's in reference to religion, I think that is symbolic of the attitude of culture to, all truth across the board. That let's be tolerant of each other, and appreciate the fact that there are different views. No one is necessarily more right than another. You're entitled to your opinions if you want. I mean, at the same time, it's a schizophrenic world in which we live. At the same time, there's an ideology which is being crammed down our throats, which it's prevalent in academia in the United States, for instance. And if you don't go according to that orthodoxy and sign on to it, then you risk, possibly you risk your career. You certainly will fall out and not be held in high esteem or in favor with any academic authorities of repute. But I think deep down, I think it's expressive of a deep spiritual crisis, which is, a reluctance to surrender ourselves to something higher than ourselves, namely God and the truth. God is truth, and the truth sets us free. And, that today's secular world and becoming ever more secular, there is, you use the word allergic. That's the word here. This allergic reaction against surrendering myself, surrendering my heart, especially when it comes to God. We know that it's not just a surrender of one's mind, it's also a surrender of one's heart. Because in doing that, it's as if one is giving up one's own autonomy. And what is greater in today's culture than one's autonomy? Where personal autonomy is held up in highest esteem, well, then any other authority is going to be a rival to that, is going to be looked upon suspiciously, if not inimically. Whether it's God, whether it's the church, whether it's the order of nature. I mean, this is a big problem that we encounter in morality. Speaking of a rule of morality grounded in, for instance, human nature. I'm referencing natural law. With God, the author of our nature, standing behind it, this becomes very difficult. But so I think as much as it's an intellectual crisis, it stems from and flows from a deeper spiritual crisis, which is this keeping God at arm's length. Because it's this illusion that I'm going to lose myself. I'm going to lose I'm going to lose my identity. I'm going to lose my autonomy. The truth, of course, is just the opposite. Those of us that have given our lives over to Christ know that only in surrendering ourselves completely to God do we find ourselves. Only in admitting that there is a truth and pursuing it do we find freedom? Are we set free? And do we find that our deepest yearnings satisfied?
Yeah. Now, the point about freedom is one that's near and dear to the Freiburg School, if one can speak of a Freiburg School of theology, but certainly Father Servais Pinckaers, who would have still been alive when you were here, who passed right about when I entered the order, spoke often of freedom as a kind of adherence to the good, right? Because you are not free insofar as you have the option to do fell things or things which ultimately undermine your humanity. You're free to the degree or to the extent that you are bound up so intimately with the good that you become the type of person who cannot do otherwise. Not because you lack creativity, but because why would you deflect yourself from the course of the good if you were so wholly and entirely convinced that your flourishing lay therein? And so, yeah, I think that when it comes to the truth, to describe the truth as the good of the intellect, I think help brings that into focus. This idea that, our minds will only ever be reconciled to reality insofar as they correspond to it, right? So there's no truth to be had in ideology. There's no truth to be had in strange fantasy. It's only in reconciling ourselves to the fact of what we are. It's like, okay, if I am, fill in the appropriate negative adjective, well, it's good to know that about myself. Because then maybe I can work on it, or maybe I can accept it, or maybe I can seek healthy correction on it. But if I go about denying it, then, well, we're in a fix, right? Because there's no point of departure. I'm thinking about this, describing here, an openness, which you kind of put in these terms of holding God off at arm's length, like an unwillingness to be open to that. And this brings in the conversation about revelation. Okay, so there are things that we can know by the inquiry of reason, and there are things that we cannot know by the inquiry of reason, and we need to be aided by the revelation of God. And so many of the things that you describe in the course of your talk rely upon revelation. And I think, sometimes you'll hear from skeptics or critics that it's a black box claim, it can't be proved. It's the type of thing that, once you give them the keys to the car, sure, they're going to drive around in it, but I don't give you the keys to the car. So in response to that, would you say that are there reasonable arguments, kind of like apologetic arguments, or, things of that sort, which help kind of break us open more to, or maybe, cast in a more acceptable light for the skeptical 21st century man, this idea, or not this idea, but this reality of revelation, that there could be something from beyond that addresses us in our limitations and brings us forth from it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there is the human experience on a natural level of a kind of revelation, in as much as, you tell me, you reveal certain things about yourself to me, and what I know about you, you're a credible, trustworthy person. So why shouldn't I believe that? And I believe that, but I'm making an act of faith in doing that. So is that unreasonable? Oh, I don't think so. In fact, what would life be like if none of us did that? If we had to, speaking of G.K. Chesterton, he was noting, the human ordering to truth, and this explains why it's so easy to lie, because and to get away with it, because we have a natural affinity to the truth and to communicating the truth in our speech. And so imagine what life would be like if you had to be skeptical of anything anyone ever told you in the course of a day. We don't do that. We by and large, we just believe what people say to us, even if they're total strangers. And this is, I think, what's operating here on a subconscious level is the fact that we are ordered to the truth, that we do have a natural affinity for the truth, that it more often than not comes out in our speech, so that we assume rightly that people are being honest and truthful with us. So that's all at a natural level. And, that it's perfectly reasonable. In fact, it would be extreme to try to live otherwise. Unnatural, inhuman, even. So it is the same by analogy when it comes to supernatural revelation, whereby God reveals things about himself and us to us, many of which we wouldn't know if he didn't reveal this to us. Well, what's unreasonable about that necessarily, especially if God's existence itself is reasonable. This is where it's helpful, especially if you're entering into the mind of St. Thomas, that God's existence itself is not only reasonable, it's rationally compelling. That arguments are on the side of God's existence, not against God's existence. And so if God must exist, rationally speaking, well, is it much of a stretch to say that it's possible that God intervene in human history and in human lives and reveal himself and cultivate relationship with human beings, especially since God is truth. Truth must exist. Otherwise, if truth didn't exist, well, then what would be the standard of measure by which we could judge anything to be true, even a mathematical truth like 2 + 2 = 4? It would be nonsensical to say that is true, because if there's no standard of measure of truth, then truth is nothing. But when we say 2 + 2 = 4, then we're acknowledging, even subconsciously, that this mathematical proposition 2 + 2 = 4, it participates in truth itself. In truth. So if God exists and God is truth, then what God reveals, then God is is the supremely trustworthy source if he is to disclose certain things about himself, and to reveal himself. Now, there's that. And there's also, we can also appreciate, just speaking of this apologetically, from the angle of those who have claimed that God's revelation has been offered to them. I'm speaking specifically of, say, the prophets, oracle of the Lord, word of the Lord, where they are asserting that God has spoken to them, and they are passing on now God's revealed word, or most especially to the apostles. Let's just take the apostles, for instance. Now, they claim to have witnessed in an intimate way the ministry, and most especially the death and the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. So, that on one level, claiming that they know a person who's come back from the dead would seem crazy, because there's not any other historical instance where one can say, I know someone who's come back from the dead, and not just come back from the dead, not be revived from death, but never to die again. Well, then what makes you believe these apostles? Well, okay. There are several things that one can point to. First, that if they made this up, then they were willing to suffer torture, persecution, and death to make up what they knew was a fabrication. St. Paul says that that Jesus appeared to 500 of us, and he names names. You don't name names if it's concocted, if it's fabricated, because of course you could easily verify it then with those people. You certainly don't name 500 names, but most especially through the course of the history of the church, the difference in the lives that the church has made, the saints that the church has produced. Pope Benedict XVI, he said that the strongest argument in favor of God's existence and of the church are saints. And how to explain this? How to account for what is really non-existent in the ancient world before Christ. Let's hold up the great human models of the ancient world. Let's look at Rome and Aeneas, or for Homer, it's someone like Odysseus, or Hector, perhaps, what have you. These individuals certainly, on one level, they're great, heroic human individuals, but they're not saints. They're far from it. You don't have a Mother Teresa who, I was watching a documentary a few years ago. Mother Teresa recounts the experience. The first time she picked up a poor man in the streets, he was being eaten with worms. And he asked her why she was doing this to him. And he said, "Because I love you." This, one doesn't find anything like this before Christ, really. I mean, one finds foreshadowings of it in the chosen people of Israel, but not in its fullest extent, in the sense of fullness of self-giving love, which indeed comes from Christ and comes from Christ on the cross. So, and at the end of the day, Father Gregory, boy, I tell you, I would say, then what do you have without God, without what is offered to you, if you accept divine revelation? Eternal life, and meaning for suffering, a real answer to the most fundamental existential questions that human beings pose. Without divine revelation, one has no real meaningful answers to those questions. So you choose. I choose a meaningful life. I choose a happy life.
All right, kudos. Well, I'm glad you did, because otherwise this conversation would have, it'd be difficult to go forward. Nah, that's not entirely true. I mean, sometimes it's exciting talking to atheists, but yeah, I think, insofar as you share a communion on a more profound basis, then yeah, you can go a little further in a conversation. All right, maybe to give one to the atheists, which is to say we're not going to give one to the atheists, but if we were to give one to the atheists, in your estimation, you've probably, in your studies, in your work, in your research, you've come across a variety of arguments against the divine institution of the church or against the possibility of revelation, like things that touch on the theme that you described in your lecture. Of those ones, can you identify one that you think to be especially powerful? And then do you have a way by which of addressing it or kind of, clapping back?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there's just the assumption that what can't be seen isn't real, or that, I found conceptually that for atheists, this is especially true of the new atheists, that their conception of God is not an intellectually coherent conception of God, or it's at least not what St. Thomas means by God. It's not what we mean by God. They consider God to be, they'll make fun that we have astronauts to go up into space and looking for God, and they didn't find him there, so he doesn't exist. God is not one being among others, God is not of this world. He is beyond this world. And he is the source of being itself. He's not one being, he is being. So there is no proper proportionality between the world and God. And of course, only with such a being can created being or finite being be accounted for. Can we understand it? So, I find that a first move that one has to make is to make sure that we understand the same thing when we say the word God, and that if we just mean that God is just this old guy with a beard who stands around the corner and tells us what to do, shouts commandments at us, or is just the biggest, strongest guy in the block. He's the one with the nuclear missiles. Even St. Augustine in the Confessions acknowledges that he labored for a long time under the illusion that God had a body, that God was a body. And it wasn't until he was freed of that illusion that his mind literally, the skies opened, and he had a revelation. And he got the God thing. So that's the more conceptual issue, I would say, and just the the Enlightenment view that all of reality is flattened out, reduced to material reality, reality that you can visibly perceive and measure. So to address that, why no one really believes that. No one really lives their lives, in accordance with such a strict reductionist view of reality. Okay, there's that, and then there's the problem of evil, the existential problem of evil, and the assumption that if there is the existence of evil, then God cannot exist. There are issues with there. It's certainly a false assumption. But it's a one thing I like to point out is that objection against God's existence on the basis of the existence of evil in itself is a fruit of the biblical revelation. Because it's only the Bible that tells us that God is moral, that God is holy, the Holy One, and God is merciful. So the way the objection goes, if God is loving and merciful, then why would he? How could he allow for evil? Well, you only speak of God as loving and merciful on account of the biblical witness. In other words, this was not an issue for the ancient world outside the Bible. The Greeks and the Romans were not objecting to God's existence on account of the existence of evil. In fact, evil was to be attributed to the gods. If you're speaking of the natural religions of the ancient world, the gods themselves were responsible for evil. That's this is how to understand it. So it's a biblical framework to pose the problem is itself biblically inspired, flowing from the biblical witness. Okay, but in any case, that the Bible has profound answers to that question, and it reaches a high point in the Old Testament with the Book of Job, and then of course in the New Testament with the death and resurrection of Jesus himself.
As you turn to, I think of Prima Pars Question 2, Article 3 on the existence of God, when St. Thomas says for his arguments against the existence of God, well, you don't need this hypothesis on account of the fact that you have a science which is sufficient, and then also evil. How do you square that with the God whom you're about to describe in these glowing terms? But it's fascinating. Like in the 20th century, it seems that the way that this evil argument is picked up, a lot of people focus on the evil that is wrought by Christians. So this notion like you've been behind the Inquisition and the Crusades and all kinds of things besides. I think it's C.S. Lewis who says in Mere Christianity that the greatest argument against Christianity is Christians. Today I was having a conversation with a religious sister who pertains to the Schoenstatt community. She's a really excellent woman, very wise. And she was just recounting this little parable where she says, a man, kind of like a merchant, was talking to a Christian priest, and this merchant happened to be a producer of soap. And they were like sitting in the town square looking at all of the mess of humanity that passed by. And the merchant said something to the effect of like, you've had, centuries and centuries. And what have you done? What have you Christians done to improve the state of man? They're just the same, kind of filthy, unreformed, like animals that they always were. And so like the priest, looks and sees in the foreground this little boy who's playing in the mud. And he says, and you, producer of soap, after hundreds and hundreds of years, you haven't yet achieved the goal of making man clean. Like, look at this young child. And so, the merchant claps back and says like, well, soap can't make clean unless it's applied. And he says, and there you have the response. Christianity can't make good unless it's lived. And so it's fascinating that like people will often use arguments against the faith when it's not so much a matter of the thing itself as the living of the thing. I think it's again Chesterton who says that it's not that Christianity has been found wanting; it's been that it's found difficult and then left untried, or that it's been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried.
Yeah.
All right, so we have time for one more question, and I thought, maybe just you touched on this at the end of your lecture, and it's a really fascinating topic that I think a lot of our listeners are asking themselves. But there seems to be this tension in the church between, on the one hand, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, like when you read, you referenced considerably the documents of the Second Vatican Council. I'm thinking here of Lumen Gentium when you get into the teens where we're talking about membership or incorporation. And the document acknowledges elements of grace and salvation outside of the visible church, which pertain to, the Catholicity of the church and have a kind of tendency towards the church. So on the one hand, we're saying outside of the church, there is no salvation. And then on the other hand, we're saying that there are elements of grace and salvation outside the church, which have a kind of dynamism towards the church. So when people are thinking about the question of salvation, when they're worrying about all of those whom they know and love who have died, perhaps without the sacraments or on their way to the faith, or maybe in a momentary break with the faith, like what are some principles or some arguments that you set forth in response to that?
Yeah, this is really important, especially in today's culture where so many people do consider themselves spiritual but not religious, or they aren't affiliated with any religion in particular, certainly not with the Christian faith, that outside the church no salvation. This is to say the same as outside of Christ there's no salvation. Christ is the sole unique mediator between man and God. He is our sole Savior. But and Christ continues to save the world through the church by His will and by His institution. In St. Thomas, this is where I love St. Thomas saying that. The reason God does this, he doesn't have to continue to save the world through the instrumentality of the church, composed of sinners who give great scandal through their lifestyles more often than not. It's in order to ennoble man, St. Thomas says. In order to give man a share in the dignity that's proper to him, he makes human beings to be instruments of salvation themselves, but instruments of salvation. Okay, but at the same time, Christ is not limited by the church. He's not confined to the church. He's not confined to the sacraments. That the power of God, the power of Christ, is infinite, and a profound, fundamental Catholic principle that is at play here is that the grace of Christ can be mysteriously present in anyone's life, no matter what they're professing, no matter how it appears on the outside. You might even have an atheist, but who knows? Maybe that atheist is of invincible goodwill, and so invincible ignorance, so they're not at fault, perhaps. Only God can read the human mind and heart. Only He can know when that's the case. But they are of fundamental goodwill. And one really, I would argue, cannot be a fundamental goodwill without the grace of Christ, because of the power of sin and the grip that sin holds on our hearts. To be a person of fundamental goodwill means that, in essence, one is committed to the good. One is committed to a good greater than my own good, my own private good, and I think one can only do that with the grace of Christ. So we must always hope that no matter what disposition or say conceptual framework a person might end one's life in, one never knows, and one never knows how God was at work or perhaps present in that person's life. Even in the case of suicide, one doesn't know what went through that person's mind and heart to lead them to that point. But at the end of the day, we know that God's causality is greater than Adam's causality. That Christ's redemptive power is stronger than human sin, and Christ's mercy is God wants to save us. He desires the salvation of all, as St. Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:5. He desires everyone to be saved, and He's made it as easy as possible to be saved, to profess faith in the Lord Jesus and be baptized. But we look at it wrongly if we think that becomes then an obstacle to a person's salvation if they haven't experienced that. It's not to make it difficult, it's not to set up a roadblock to salvation, but to make it as easy as possible. So, so the grace of Christ can be operative in any person's life, and at the end of the day, it requires us to refrain from passing judgment on a person. Only God can do that. Of course, we can pass judgment on the externalities and recognize that, there are objective deficiencies here. Insofar as one is not Catholic, there is an objective deficiency. One has all the means of salvation available to oneself in the Catholic faith. So if one is not Catholic, one has, partial means then, or the possibility of partial means. And then where there's partial means, there's the possibility of salvation. Basta così, right?
Yeah.
Full stop.
Grazie mille. No, that's great. That's wonderful. That's super helpful. And those are great principles for us to, kind of take hold of and then suss out in future conversations as we go forth, thinking about this particular issue, which is a vexing one. All right. So thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for investing more in this lecture than one ordinarily might. If folks want to follow up with you, maybe particular books or particular articles, particular projects that you're currently involved in, are there places to which you might direct our attention?
Sure. I've published a lot of articles in Novet Vetera and in the Thomist, but they can certainly send me an email, pcgondreau@gmail.com. I don't have a website, or I don't have a Twitter handle either, but certainly I would invite them to send me an email. I will have a book coming out, a collection of my essays on touching on human sexuality in various respects. That'll be coming out by Emmaus. Emmaus, but that'll be that's shortcoming. I haven't supplied the essays yet, but it'll be coming out soon. So.
Perfect. Hey, congratulations on that. That's great. All right, so that's all we have for you with this installment of Off-Campus Conversations. We now have a name for these biweekly installments, so you can you can cite that. Bingo, bango. If you haven't yet, please do subscribe to the Thomistic Institute podcast wherever you consume your content, whether that be on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. And then look at ThomisticInstitute.org for upcoming events, so lectures on campus, conferences, intellectual retreats, et alia huius modi, as St. Thomas Aquinas would say. And for those of you who aren't weird people, that means and other things besides, or other things of the same sort. So thanks so much for listening. Know of our prayers for you. Please pray for us, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on the Thomistic Institute podcast.